concept that ape creatures have evolved and developed into modern humans. There has never been found to this point a credible link between monkeys and men, tying the two together. Now, what about the other concept, the creationist perspective? According to the Bible, original man came on the scene suddenly and perfected. And the biblical creationist model is completely opposite and contrasts the evolutionary perspective. On the chart here, we see the evolution model represented by a line which starts at the bottom and begins to go upward on an incline. The further back in time, the more primitive mankind. And as we approach modern time, the more intelligent. If we look at the biblical model, we see that in the beginning, man was created in the image of God, and then over a period of time degenerated or fell. And we see that there were various peaks of civilization, high peaks of civilization, where man turned away from God and turned to the fallen spiritual dimension and became involved in witchcraft, in various kinds of satanic practices, and God brought judgment upon these various civilizations. Of course, the first major judgment that occurred was the flood of Noah. And then throughout the Old Testament, we see there are other periods where catastrophes took place, where God brought judgment upon societies of the past that had turned away from Him and turned to satanic witchcraft practices. So we can see the biblical creationist model totally contrasts with the evolutionary model. The Bible does not suggest that people of the past did not live primitive lives. In fact, there have been many primitive people of the past, societies of the past, who have turned away from God and have chosen to live such lives, lives associated with their worship of the fallen spiritual satanic realm. And so, yes, in the past, people did live primitive and did live cave-like lives. They were break-offs of high peaks of civilization. Now, for a moment, let's look to the biblical account to give us a glimpse of what people of the past were like. According to the Bible, the first man and the first woman were created, and they were the most intelligent beings that have ever existed. In Genesis chapter 1, and in verse 26, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And God created man in His own image. So original man came on the scene suddenly and perfected. Original man had abilities and capacities that God had given them. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, we're told, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." So God breathed part of Himself into man, and man was created with a body, a soul, and a spirit. In Psalms chapter 8 and verse 5, we're told that God made man just a little lower than the angels, or the Hebrew word is Elohim, just a little lower than God. So the Bible gives us a glimpse of what original ancient man was like. Adam was in fellowship and harmony with all things around him. He was created with a spiritual awareness and sensitivity. He was loving. He was noble. He was appreciative. He was gracious. He had attributes and characteristics like God. And of course, Adam and Eve were created with a free will to choose whether or not they would remain in this harmonious, loving relationship with their Creator. In verse 26 of Genesis 1, we're told that they were given dominion over the whole earth. They had complete wisdom and understanding. They used 100% of their brain. They were perfect. Not the small portion of the brain that we use today. Original man was the most advanced, intelligent being that has ever existed. As we mentioned, they were created with a free will. The Bible indicates that this original man, original woman, Adam and Eve, chose not to be obedient to the Creator, Although God gave them that choice, they chose not to be obedient to the Creator, rejected the Creator, and followed Satan, who enticed them to rebel or reject God and to follow him. And as a result of the sinful act that man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, performed, there was a fall from that perfect creation and a separation and a degeneration, which then occurred through subsequent generations. But the Bible indicates to us that in spite of the fall, Adam, after he had surrendered his will to Satan, the civilizations that followed were still highly advanced, had tremendous abilities. And we're given that account in Genesis chapter 4. In verse 2, we're told, "And Abel was a keeper of the flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." So original man was involved in animal husbandry and agriculture. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 17. And we're told, "And Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch, and he built a city, and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son." Original man was able to build cities. Not primitive mud huts, but cities. And, as we'll see later, advanced cities have been found all over the ancient world in the past. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 20. "And Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock." Once again, animal husbandry. Verse 21, "His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and the pipe." They made and played musical instruments. And in verse 22, "Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron." They understood metallurgy. And then, of course, the Bible indicates to us that at this period of history, these ancients lived to approximately 900 years of age. And you could imagine the tremendous abilities that would, and the things that could be accomplished over such a long period of time. Now, that's just a tiny little glimpse of what the Bible tells us what original man was like. Highly advanced, tremendous abilities, tremendous capacities. Now, if this biblical model has any validity, then certainly we should be able to point to some evidence which supports it. If we look at the evidence left to us by ancient civilizations, we find that the further back we go, the more amazing are the accomplishments. The abilities and the capacities of the ancients are tremendous things which we cannot even explain. Great civilizations just suddenly appear without any primitive beginnings. And civilizations disappear very suddenly. And it appears in many cases catastrophically. Have been wiped out, in some cases mysteriously. Unexplainable remains, artifacts, and precious belongings left behind, covered over in catastrophic deposition. Now, the Bible tells us that the original civilization, the pre-flood civilization, was completely annihilated and devastated in a great global catastrophe, the Noahic flood. And personally, I believe that civilizations existing before the flood have been completely destroyed and literally taken into the earth. In one of our earlier presentations, we've referred to Ezekiel 26, where it appears that the earth's crust is fractured and open, and civilizations of the past dropped into the earth. And of course, this taking place at the time of the flood. Following the flood, civilizations repopulated the earth, and we're told in the Genesis account that man was instructed to repopulate the earth, but chose not to be obedient to the Creator, but to remain in one location. And in Genesis chapter 11, we're told that the Tower of Babel was built in the city of Babylon. When God had given them the directions to spread around the world, they said, "No, God, we will not do that. We will remain in this place." And they built a city and a tower, not to reach God, but to reach the fallen spiritual dimension. And God was angered, confounded their languages, and mankind was spread around the world. And as we'll see, as we look at archaeology throughout the world, we see that the ancients spread and continued to build pyramids and ziggurat temple structures in order to worship the heavens, which they worshiped as their gods and their deities. That is the biblical model. Is there evidence to support the biblical model? Well, let's take a few minutes and look at some of that evidence. There's a great controversy today regarding this subject of ancient man. Reader's Digest, May 75, page 35, in an article entitled "When Did Civilizations Begin?" makes this statement: "New findings have made shambles of the traditional theory of prehistory." The evolutionary perspective. On the chart here, we see the evolution model represented by a line which starts at the bottom and begins to go upward on an incline. The further back in time, the more primitive mankind. And as we approach modern time, the more intelligent. If we look at the biblical model, we see that in the beginning, man was created in the image of God, and then over a period of time, degenerated or fell. And we see that there were various peaks of civilization, high peaks of civilization, where man turned away from God and turned to the fallen spiritual dimension and became involved in witchcraft, in various kinds of satanic other concept, the creationist perspective. According to the Bible, original man came on the scene suddenly and perfected. And the biblical creationist model is completely opposite in concept that ape creatures have evolved and developed into modern humans. There has never been found to this point a credible link between monkeys and men, tying the two together. Now, what about